Hey everybody, it's Randy Kennard of the Saddle Station Farm. So we just had a question from a fellow about composting chickens on the farm. Many of you know, we just lost 14 of our meat birds 2 weeks from going to get processed just the other day. And he was asking about feeding those chickens to the pigs. That's a separate topic. I'm not opposed to it. But day in and day out, if we have rats that we've trapped, or mice, or you're doing your own processing and you have all the offal left over, the intestines and the feathers and the feet and the heads, or occasionally, like with broilers, you tend to have a certain amount of natural mortality, a small percentage, then you still have issues like we've had a fox or raccoon that's come by and decimated a bunch of them. If you trapped a skunk, a raccoon, you can have a place to put them. So day in and day out, if we had those, we compost everything. There's a lot of like hobby farm kind of books out there, beginning farmer composting deals, and there's some, they often recommend or say that you can't or shouldn't compost animals, and I think it's foolish. I guess it depends on what context you're using it. So, three of the big problems you run into when you're composting animals is that you have to ensure you have enough carbon material. You can think about nitrogen, if you're and this won't be a big deep dive into composting, but when you're composting, you essentially need like your greens, which is your nitrogen source, and your browns, which is your carbon source. And you can think about your greens, and animals would fall into this as well. Any green plant matter that's going to break down, that has a lot of moisture content in it, fresh veggies, an animal's going to have all the bodily fluids and the meat, the flesh itself, all that stuff is essentially going to be a nitrogen source. Your carbon source is your stable, dry, woody carbon material. Wood chips, old straw, brown stuff, leaves are great ones, paper products, hay, old hay that's old and brown, that really will act as a carbon source, but when it's fresh, hay as a grass, it kind of can act like have a bit of a nitrogen source. Hay kind of falls in the middle sometimes. But the point is, you want about a 25 to 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, and every plant matter or animal matter is going to have a different ratio of what it is. But essentially, something really high in nitrogen, like an animal carcass, needs a lot of carbon. You can throw something like leaves, you can bury your animal in a pile of leaves, and it will break down, but leaves just disintegrate like there's no tomorrow. I found that what I like is wood chips. Wood chips are a very complex form of carbon. It's hard for them to break down, and they're generally quick and easy to get a hold of. I mean, you can probably drive up and down the road and see where they've tree trimming guys have come by and trimmed the tree lines and blown all the wood chips out, and you can take a 50-gallon barrel and pick them up for nothing. They're super cheap and easy to get to. Pine shavings, you could go buy a bag of pine shavings if you wanted to spend money on composting things, but it's an option. When that animal breaks down and maggots get in there and bugs get in there and it starts to disintegrate, having an abundance of carbon is going to ensure that there's no nitrogen loss to the atmosphere. You're essentially taking any potential volatile compounds and you're binding them in carbon, which will eventually just break down into a stable molecular substrate, right? And that's what it ends up becoming compost. It smells really good, just smells like rich, fresh earth, and that's the goal. When it's smelling awful, that's when you have a lot of anaerobic bacteria, a lot of bacteria that can be harmful to humans. So to avoid that, have an excess abundance of a woody material. So the three biggest complaints, or I guess oppositions to composting animals is, one, the odor. Two, there's the claim that it will attract other animals to your compost. And three is the potential for pathogenic fungi and microorganisms or bacterias anything bad that we don't want has a higher likelihood of being transferred to humans in partially composted substrates. So number one, it smells bad. That's easily negated if you have enough carbon. If you have enough carbon, there's no odors being given off. They're being captured and bound. You may have some residual ones, but this pile behind us is where we actually have, we got over 14 chickens in there. There's a skunk, there's a raccoon, there's a number of rats. It's been a rough season this year for our chickens. Mice. Let me see, I shot 2 turkeys this past spring out hunting, so the carcasses went in there. So there's been a lot of stuff going on, and we have guests here all the time. We've never noticed a single thing. And even I'm not even that far from it, and there's a few flies on the top of it. It actually needs probably another 4 inches of wood chips, which I'll probably take care of shortly. But I'm downwind of it, and you wouldn't even know there was animals there unless you got right on top of it. And you can see a couple feet sticking through and a few things, because it's not 100%. After I'm done with this video, I'm going to do a little bit of work to it and add to it. So odors, they can be, that issue can be negated pretty easily, right? Number 2, attracting other animals. That's ridiculous, depending on the time of season. So right now we're in the middle of summer. Any fox, raccoon, skunk, small bear, anything that's going to want to try to get into this pile can, but its choice is eating a fresh frog or mouse or bird or whatever it wants to eat, or berries and fruits in the areas of the strawberries are out, blueberries are getting ready to come out, raspberries have just come out. I mean, there's an abundance of fresh food sources versus going and foraging for this old rotten carrion. It's just not going to happen. Right? The middle of winter, there's very little food. The animals need calories, and there's not much to get onto. Yeah, they're probably going to be more likely to get into it. But even then, it's only minimal. If everything's breaking down quickly when it's hot out, or if your compost pile is hot enough, things are going to break down pretty quickly anyway. And probably within a week, there's nothing there for them to eat anyway. The chickens, actually, if we don't have enough wood chips on there, we know because we can smell it. But then you'll start to actually see physical maggots show up. And that, the chickens love, right? So we get chickens and birds that'll show up and say, hey, check this out. It's not really intentional. I suppose you could look at it as a food source, but when we see that, we end up just filling it over just because we don't want to smell it and let it break down. And the chickens can go eat all the other bugs in the rest of the farm. That's not an issue. So the third issue would just be the possibility for disease transmission. Any pathogens that are in there that are bad bacteria, you know, in that they could potentially make us sick or harm us. You kind of have like 2 protocols. One is either getting your compost pile hot enough, you know, so you know, above whatever it is, pasteurization temperatures, 140 degrees, 160 degrees. Maybe it's different. I'd have to check for sure on real numbers. But you get it hot enough, essentially, to cook off and kill any bad bacteria, and just you leave the beneficial, non-harmful bacteria that can survive those temperatures. So a lot of compost books, guides, what have you, will recommend some degree of temperature management. And that makes a lot of sense if you've got a garden and you want to compost this and then use this on your vegetable garden. It makes a lot of sense to be a little more intensive and kind of rotate things, and you know, you get bins where you're shoveling compost from one area to another and you're rotating it and you're flipping it, and I don't. That's an awful lot of work, and I am not in a, we don't raise vegetables, so we're not in a high demand where we need lots of compost. The other control measure other than temperature tends to be time, right? You go long enough and eventually the bad bacteria are going to die off. You're going to just, if I left this, you know, 5 years from now, this would be just completely soil, you know, probably less than that. I think that the minimum is like 6 months for animal manures. Like if you wanted to get your organic certification and I brought in manure from a non-organic farm, I believe in order for me to use that manure on my vegetables, it has to go through like a 120-day, 180-day incubation phase, you know, whatever it is, where it is allowed to break down fully. And of course you wouldn't want to use fresh manures anyway, but there's a time period at which all the bacteria and microorganisms have essentially run their course, and then it's relatively safe. Same thing with this. If you have enough carbon, everything's going to break down super quick anyway. We're probably just going to let this fill up for the rest of the year. You know, 2 years isn't uncommon at all on our situation for a compost pile to sit there before we ever use it. So next year, beside this one, I'll probably start a separate pile for things that happen. You know, we trap in the fall, so we've got beaver carcasses, and if we get a deer this year, there's always bits and pieces of something. If we have a big pig roast or big barbecue, all those bones, everything's going to go right into the pile. We're going to let it break right down. So with a 2-year span, I'm really not worried about any pathogens coming to get me or hurting me. Also, if most of this compost isn't going to be used in a direct, say, vegetable context. You know, I'm not using this to put into a row and then plant root vegetables like carrots and potatoes into tubers. You know, I'm not planting. We may use it some in our small little garden for maybe some tomatoes, corn, some beans, something like that. But really, the primary goal for me is going to be around fruit trees, right? So it's going to eventually just feed that soil. Eventually, the tree is going to take it up. Eventually, there'll be apples, pears, plums, peaches, that kind of thing, and then we can use that fruit to feed our animals, and where we're just recycling nutrients. So on my situation, compost is not a critical component of my farm success. However, it is important, I feel, to recycle what nutrients we can, and I need to be able to do that as efficiently as possible so that I'm not wasting my time or sanity doing things like shoveling all day long. So those three, the odor, the wild animals, and the potential pathogens, they're all relatively, it depends on what context you're doing them in. So they do all have points. If you were on a small market farm where you really needed lots of compost for your garden vegetables and you kind of wanted a high turnover, I might recommend having 3 or 4 bins where that's, you're just using plant matter, leaves and grass clippings and old veggie parts from the garden, like corn stalks, to actually create a compost that you use back into that garden. And then maybe just having a separate one like this, which is kind of set aside really for composting animals, because you really don't want to be smelling rotten animals all over your land. And the alternative is throwing them in the woods, burying them. That's a lot of work too. You go shovel stuff and then you don't really get anything out of it. Putting it on your neighbor's land, probably not the best if you enjoy your neighbors. So yeah, so that's about it that I can think of now. We'll probably go into a deep dive later on if you guys are interested about composting, because I'll have to look up some of the particulars myself. But that's the way we do it. So whenever you can certainly compost wild animals, farm losses. There's no reason you can't, but just be aware if you're doing it. Make sure you have enough carbon, and give it enough time to either make sure that you're getting your temperatures high enough or a length of time. I guess that's about it. I can't say any more on that. Alright, if you got any questions, if I missed something, let me know. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.